Gotcha. Enough of that noise. Here's some of my noise. Yes, greeting, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. You know, censorship is a big problem down there on Earth, and no one's talking about it. So, we're going to talk about it. That's why I've interrupted Second Nature. I'm not censoring Second Nature. Consider it an editorial decision. Hit it, Nancy. Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English only sign 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
I live in a communication satellite, so I watch a lot of TV. I saw Judas Priest was found not guilty of inciting teenage suicide, but Two Live Crew are facing a whole slew of obscenity charges. A museum in Cincinnati showing some Robert Mapplethorpe photographs has been charged with obscenity, and Salman Rushdie is still in hiding. It's okay, I won't tell him you're here. You can't burn the flag in America, but you can burn comic books in New Zealand and Britain. What? Oh, what? Burn books in this day and age? Oh, yes, friends. Customs officials in Kiwi and the UK have been destroying comic books. And comic book shops north and south of the 49th parallel are facing obscenity charges. And as well, print shops are not printing comics that they deem as offensive. All this censorship, I'm telling you, the world is going straight to heck.
Comic books are very big on good as opposed to evil, right as opposed to wrong, responsibility as opposed to selfishness. If all of the derangos on the religious right would actually read a comic book once in a while, instead of holding them up and saying how they're satanic, they would see that they really do come down firmly and solidly 100% on the side of proper behavior. And even if they don't, it's none of their damn business. Let them stay in their churches, and we will stay in the museums.
Some artists would argue that we aren't affected by what we read or see on TV. Of course we're affected. We pay money to see movies and to read books precisely because they will affect us.
I have a friend that is a sales rep to these different hospitals, and she met this little boy that had all this turtle stuff around him, and his fingers were bandaged, you know, because he got them jammed trying to lift up a sewer cover to go down the sewer. And, you know, I sent the kids some comics and said, please, the turtles are on TV, they're in the movies, they're not in the sewer, and stuff that would, that bothers me. I would never want anybody to get hurt.
Okay, so we're affected by what we see, but can a silly Ninja Turtle comic or a heavy metal album really turn Archie Andrews into Freddy Krueger?
Somebody made the point yesterday that a man like, Reverend Donald Wildman, who knows what is best for us to see on television, and who knows about all of this satanic corruption. This man is exposed to this material 24 hours a day. He looks at this crap constantly. He looks at the girly magazines. He looks at the child porn. He looks at people doing it with animals. He looks at comic books that are filled with Satanism. He listens to records that are played backward and make no sense except to him. And somehow the Reverend Donald Wildman is not corrupted. Now, does this mean that he is better than all the rest of us poor slobs? That if we look at this, we will certainly go to hell immediately? No, what it means is that he is full of caca. He is full of horse pucky, and if people would stand up to fools like him and Phyllis Schlafly and all of the rest of these goddamn censors, we would find a much better condition of life for all of us. Not to be too perforce about it.
There were no limits at all on comic books until the mid-1950s when, among other things, Dr. Frederick Wertham wrote a book, Seduction of the Innocent. The book said, in effect, that comics were taking young, impressionable minds and turning them into fascist stormtroopers who would go around torturing the family pet with power tools. Parents got excited. Oh, yes, comics turned our boy bad. We tried to beat it out of him, didn't we, Thelma? We locked him in the fruit cellar for weeks on end, but nothing could undo the damage done by those satanic stories about little Lotta. Do we get paid for this?
The Comic Code Authority came into power in 1954. To make a long story short, there was a congressional hearing that was trying to link comics with juvenile delinquency and trying to say that comics were responsible for juvenile delinquency. The comic book industry in America panicked. Richard Goldwater, who was at that time the head of Archie Comics, put together with the other affluent, and this is important, the other affluent New York comic publishers, the Comic Code Authority, which was a self-regulating board. It was an in-industry censor, if you will. And it was an attempt to circumvent what they feared, which would be government regulation. Well, it worked. There was no government regulation of comics. But I don't believe it was due to the creation of the Comic Code Authority. I think it was due to the fact that the Senate hearings discovered that, indeed, comics were not solely responsible for juvenile delinquency. Nevertheless, the Comic Code Authority reigned over the art form in America and by proxy in much of Canada, because many of the comics coming into Canada were American in production, for roughly 20 years.
The Comic Code actually forbids the use of the word flick in a comic, because they were afraid back then with the bad printing that the ink might run together and flick might look like click.
My work has been censored, certainly. I came to work in comic books working the most stringent censorship code in entertainment, which is the Comics Code. I have seen publishers quake in fear when they receive 3 or 4 letters from some crackpot. But these days, no, not at all. I don't feel censored in the least. I think there's going to be some more fights coming. But right here and now, I'm working freely.
So, who saved us from the evil Comic Code Authority? Spider-Man. Enough said.
The first comic that really pushed a hole in it was the issue of Spider-Man that Marvel put out that dealt with drug addiction. It was an anti-drug comic, but there was a rule in the Code Authority that depiction of drug use could not be presented at all. And of course, by the 70s, drug use as a problem was too prevalent to just put those sorts of blinders on and pretend it didn't exist.
After the 3 special drug issues, the Comic Book Authority label returned to Spider-Man. The code wasn't removed permanently from a comic book until 1984, and this time it was a DC comic.
We did an issue of Swamp Thing. It was Swamp Thing number 29. It was a story entitled Love and Death. It was a story about, well, I won't go into what the story about. Basically, it dealt with imagery that showed The Walking Dead. It built to a double-page spread of The Walking Dead surrounding the key character of that story, Abigail, who's the heroine of Swamp Thing. The code balked at that. It was a code ruling that you could not present The Walking Dead in an unsavory manner. I'm not sure what the wording was. We fought it. We fought it on the basis of, I remember I sent a newspaper clipping to our editor from the local drive-in showing her what was being printed in newspapers all across America and much of Canada to advertise Night of the Living Dead type films. You know, it was just as graphic as what we were doing. When they read the book carefully, they found out that there was an element of incest in the book. I won't go into what it was, but it was a key plot point, and we were not using it in an exploitative manner. Alan Moore, coming from England, felt that there was nothing wrong with that. He said, I remember his quote at the time was that, well, growing up in England with the royal family, you assume that incest is a matter of course. Basically, we fought with them. We basically said that if they were going to censor the book, that we just didn't care to do it anymore. We would do something else. We wouldn't leave the company. We wouldn't pack up our marbles and go home. We would just divert our attentions in another way, or ask them to put the book out in direct shops only, which would mean it did not have to go through the code. Their decision was to simply not put the book out with a code approval. We did not have code approval. The sales, in fact, went up on the book. I don't believe they went up because we were presenting unsavory material in an exploitative way. I believe they went up because of the quality of the material that we were doing. We won many awards the 3 years that we were on the book, both in America and in England.
Swamp Thing readers were also reading horror writers like Stephen King. King led a whole host of horror writers to the top of the bestseller list. His novels were consistently #1, although he only came in #3 on a list of the 5 most censored authors in American public schools. Nancy, you told me about the list. Who were the other 4 authors? Nancy's my nano-cyber computer. Amongst these 4 authors, is there any common theme, any shared political beliefs, a common social agenda? Thank you, Nancy. I think we'll just shut you off. Who asked you? Horror's always had a bad rap because people figured if you're writing about evil, you must be promoting it. Comics have had censorship problems because they were always considered children's entertainment. When adult comics started coming out, parents and teachers didn't realize they were for adults. Science fiction has long been labeled a genre for juveniles. What that meant was that it's okay to take a life, but not to make a life. No sex, please. We're skittish.
Science fiction used to have big troubles with censorship. It used to be that John Campbell's secretary would cut all the sex out of the stories as it came across her desk. There's a famous story of how Cyril Kornbluth wrote into a story a scientist who had a cat, a tomcat, and later on in the story, Cyril made passing reference to a ball-bearing mousetrap and slipped it past the secretary. He dined out on that story for months.
I had a character named Heinzelman the Hell Horse. And the editor changed the name Heinzelman the Hell Horse to Atman the Scourge. I don't think he wanted to offend any Jewish people in the audience. And that's the only real, I didn't like it, but I didn't make any. And another time, there was episode in Chalwell's Chickens, I think, where there was the protagonist was a girl, and she got in a kind of a situation with a young man, and they kind of curtailed some of the elements of that a little bit, and cut a paragraph or so. I wasn't pretty innocent stuff.
How did you feel about having your stories changed?
Neither one of those cases bothered me. I could see that in both cases, I didn't want to have a gang of angry readers writing in this, call them anti-Semitics, or have people think they were erotic magazines. And so there's some reason to some of this milder forms of censorship.
Spider, have you ever been censored?
Until very recently, I would have told you that no, I've never had any trouble with censorship in science fiction. And indeed, I can't say I've been censored, but my most recent paperback, Callahan's Lady, takes place in a brothel in Brooklyn. And since it's part of a series of stories originally set in a bar called Callahan's Place, it's a spin-off from that series, I just assumed that the stories would have a home in the same magazine that had published the Callahan stories. And I was very surprised to get back a sad rejection letter from the editor saying, I loved the story, enjoyed it a great deal, had a wonderful time. Of course, I can't buy it. My readers would never stand for a story with this much sex in it. I was dismayed to hear that, and I hope he's wrong. I hope this is simply an incorrect impression on his part. But, well, the second worst thing you can do is get into an argument with an editor, and the very worst thing you can do is to win it. So I tipped my hat and agreed with him politely. On the other hand, it hasn't seemed to hurt sales any. Callahan's Lady has been the most successful of my works to date. It was on the Walden Books bestseller list for 4 months. So the readers don't want censorship. Whether the editors are going to impose it or not is a matter for the future to decide. I sure hope not.
I think, in general, that the writer has to, and the editor have to have a conference. And the writer has to say, or the editor's going to say, Henry, we're going to censor this. What do you say about that? I don't like it. Well, what are you going to do about it? If you take it away, give back the money. And, well, I don't want to do that either. I want you to print it the way I printed it. Leave my ideas in there. Can't do that, Henry. Take it or leave it. Give me the money and take your manuscript, or we print it and censor it. Well, this is clear cut. This is no reason why it shouldn't be that way. If you were writing something for the Baptist guide or something like that, and you wrote a big article in there justifying Darwin or something like that, and they wanted to censor it, you said, no, I want to do it this way. You wouldn't have a leg to stand on.
Let's talk to an editor. I'll ring up Marianne Nielsen. Marianne is the editor of On Spec, Canada's only English-language speculative fiction magazine. Marianne? Marianne, it's Commander Rick. Do you consider yourself to be a censor?
As an editor, am I a censor? I guess in a philosophical sense, you'd have to say, yes, I am, because I decide what goes in and what doesn't. I would say, though, that on a practical sense, no. There are certainly some magazines that have a mandate not to publish, for example, anything that has sex or violence in it. And if you believe that people should not be exposed to those things, then you're certainly going to not buy stories that have those things in them. I believe, however, in my opinion only, that people have the right to read anything, and no matter how objectionable I personally find it. I don't believe that there should be violent pornography, for example. I think the people who make that stuff should be hunted down and put in jail. But it's so difficult. Now, getting away from that really horrid stuff, in terms of the stories, for example, that we buy in On Spec magazine, we have had people come up to us and say, well, I have some swear words in my story, or I have a sex scene in my story, should I write it out? Well, goodness, no. If that's integral to your story, leave it in. I mean, if that's what it takes to express what's happening to your characters, if it's not gratuitous, and even if it's gratuitous, we'll tell you if we think it's gratuitous, but, it's your decision how you want to do this. You're the writer. This is your story you're telling. What we edit is bad writing.
Darn, I was going to send you some stuff I'd written. Thanks, Marianne. Before a comic or a novel reaches the bookshelf, it's been scanned by a lot of responsible people who worry about gratuitous sex, violence, racism, stereotyping, and so on. The first censor is the artist, him or herself. Now, I don't mean to say that an artist censors their imagination, but they do make creative choices.
Every single violence scene in V is done as subtly as I possibly can. There's a lot of use of shadow and imagery. And I never, ever show once throughout the whole of V any detail of violence. It's all implicit rather than explicit, and that goes with the sex as well.
Didn't show the question that dealt with it's a racist character. Question number 15. And part of the visual imagery we had to deal with, that I had to draw, was it opened up with a black guy being lynched. And that kind of made me wince, And in the end, I almost didn't do it. Because, of course, obviously, folks, I have problems with black people being lynched. And I don't know if I wanted to be a party of even drawing that kind of thing. In the end, the story went out. It was such a good story. That scene had to be in there.
How did other black comic creators react?
It's really interesting. They didn't. No, I can't remember, aside from my friends saying, good job, man.
Science fiction authors and comic book creators care about the impact of their work. Yes, even those twisted people doing those nasty adult comics. Elaine Lee and Mike Kaluta collaborate on the adult comic Starstruck. It's a very literate and very imaginative space opera. Elaine, it's Commander Rick. How do you handle violence in Starstruck?
A lot of times it's real goofy violence, and it's violence to make a point. It's like the war between the Amazons and the Dromo rustlers. When we were doing the graphic novel, Jim Shooter brought us in and said, well, why are these Amazons killing these guys? You don't make it clear. It's senseless violence, and we can't have senseless violence in comics. And I went, well, as opposed to what? Sensible violence? So we thought about what we would do, and I put a song in there. Oh, the drums were bad, 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 and so we had to kill them. So, which is, I figure, is what war and all of that's about anyway. Whatever side you're on, we are the good. God is on our side. These guys are bad. We had to get rid of them,
But Elaine, very few comics have had complaints about violence. It's usually the sex and the bodily functions that upset. You and Charles Vest set off one of the biggest controversies in comics with that story in Sabre. What was it, Morgan Tales?
Well, those stories started out as little short vignettes, little sort of fairy tale stories that I wrote for my friend Charles Vess. And they weren't even meant to be comic book scripts. They were just fun things for my friend, you know. And he got a call from Eclipse that they wanted a story, a backup story in Sabre. Would he do one? And he called me saying, I'd like to use these stories or these little vignettes that you've written.
The publishers asked myself and the writer Elaine Lee to do a story. We asked them, can we do anything we want? They said yes.
There are a lot of sort of boy initiation stories in fairy tales and in comic sort of things. And I wanted to do a girl one.
We have a story about a young witch, and it's built on the traditions of Wicca and worship of the Earth Mother. And if you're going to become a witch, then you have to give of yourself to the earth. And the little girl, being right at puberty, has her period. I believe this was the first time in comics that this was done.
We talked to the people at Eclipse, and we said, look, if this is going to be a problem, we can change the story. We don't have to have that in there. And they said, no, that's what the story is. It'll be fine. Go ahead and do it. The story came out, and after all these comic books with people's heads exploding and people being shot up and all kinds of other things, and the comic book it was in had sex scenes and violence, and more people were upset about the 2 or 3 panels in this little short story where this girl has a menstrual period than about anything that had ever been done in comics before. It was very strange. I didn't really understand it because it seemed to me if an 11-year-old can get one, why can't an 11-year-old read about one?
The first story in this magazine has people being raped and shot and killed and murdered, and that was okay. But this little girl having a natural act was really awful, and we quickly no longer had a venue to do our story in. So now, 8 years later, we found a magazine that's appropriately enough called Taboo to finish the story in the correct manner.
This is a thoroughly disgusting, deeply impressive magazine, edited and published by Steve Bissett. And there are things in here that will unsettle you, and that's what art should do. Art should knock you in the head. Art should never make you complacent. Art is supposed to alarm you. That's why all the televangelists want it censored, because it makes people think. It makes them say, wait a minute, things may not be the way we were told, and they want to re-examine. True artists break apart the social structure daily. They recreate the dream time. They hold the mirror up to reality, and they turn it slightly to give us a new view of ourselves. Only in this way are we enriched. Only in this way do we learn the lessons of the past and have some hope for controlling our destiny for the future.
You can't live in a vacuum. Believe me, I know. You gotta hear other ideas, otherwise you won't know when you're wrong, and we are all wrong once in a while, right? But as far as I'm concerned, censorship is not about language or sex or violence. That's a smokescreen. Real censorship is about ideas.
I worry about a backlash once in a while. I worry that somebody's going to tap us on the shoulder at some point and say, you know, that another Dr. Wortham is going to come along. And we have to watch out for that. We have a lot of inalienable rights, and one of them is the right to be given nightmares.
So, how do we allow Clive the freedom to create his Hellraiser comics and still prevent 5-year-olds from reading them? Well, maybe the same way we prevent 5-year-olds from seeing the Hellraiser movie with ratings. Now, I know a lot of comic book people are going to burn me in effigy for saying this, but, I mean, you go out buy a toy and it has labels, you know, ages 1.5 to 3, recommended ages 3 to 6, or fun for ages 8 to 80. And food has labels on it. If we're worried about what's going in here, shouldn't we be worried about what's going in up here? One good thing about the censorship debate is that we're allowed to debate. We're free to express our ideas about censorship without any fear of interrupt. Oh, shoot, they're jamming me. They're on to me. Listen, I don't have long now. If we're going to stop the censors and the book burners, we've got to start writing letters. We've got to keep talking. Write letters. In fact, you can write a letter to me. This is the address of my friends on the ground. Write them, they can fax it up to me, or you can fax me directly now. I made a fax machine out of an old typewriter and the starter off my car. So long, prisoners of gravity, I'm losing you. Keep watching the skies. If you can't get out of the house, watch the ceiling. Next week on Second Nature, mass beachings of whales. Is it a problem for the Ministry of Fisheries, the Ministry of the Environment, or the Department of Immigration? Plus, consumers claim their cars are rusting. Detroit says they are just biodegradable.